let's. Okay. Good morning, everyone in Europe, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Asia. A warm welcome to today's session, our third webinar on the Asia-Europe Training in Science and Technology Diplomacy 2025. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Linnea Nell, and I work in the Education Department as a project executive. Working specifically on this project on science and technology. And I have the pleasure of giving a brief introduction here today before I will hand over the floor to our moderator for today's session. So to contextualize what we'll be doing today a little bit before we head on, this webinar that we're organizing today is part of a webinar series, which is designated specifically to early career diplomats and government officials, scientists and science managers, all with the intention of joining them together for this 7-week-long program, as I've already mentioned, entitled the Asia-Europe Training on Science and Technology Diplomacy. But we're also delighted to open up these webinars for further audiences and those who are interested in learning more about this emerging field. And throughout these sessions, we hope then to be able to give you an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the key concepts related to science diplomacy, its definitions and tokens, and explore some examples of how science diplomacy is used in Asia and Europe and how it's practiced. So today's session is the third of this 5-part webinar series as such, where we'll be focusing on the emergence on innovation and technology in science diplomacy, and of course also its importance in Asia-Europe relations in this field. So just a quick note as well, our previous webinars that we organized has focused in specifically on science impacting diplomacy and diplomacy impacting science. So if you're interested in learning more about these, you can catch the full recordings of the sessions on our website, and we'll have a slide towards the end with a QR code for your easy access to this as well. A quick note, of course, is also that we are not organizing this series by ourselves. We are very proud to be organizing this in partnership with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Denmark and the Central European Scientific Society of Innovation and Technology, or CESIT for short. And we also have the support of a range of partners. We would like to acknowledge the Institute of International Science, Diplomacy and Sustainability at UCSI University in Malaysia, and the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator, GESTA for short, the National Innovation Agency of Indonesia, BRIN, the International Network of Governmental Science Advice, INSA, specifically the Asia chapter, and also last but not least, the regional focal point for Asia and the Pacific of the International Science Council. So I'll invite you to also explore these partners a bit more, as they are also doing important work in the field of science and technology diplomacy. But today's session, we're also very happy to be organizing together with the German Aerospace Center and their project management agency to bring you today's session specifically focusing on technology diplomacy and the emergence and future directions of this field. So with that brief introduction, I would like to hand over the floor to our partners at DLR and our moderator of today's session, who is Dr. Katharina Hanne, who is the scientific advisor at DLR. And we're very happy to have been working with her to bring forward today's session, and I hope to have a lot of learnings for you in the audience today. Dr. Hanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Linnea. It's an absolute pleasure to be working with ASEF on this webinar series, on this training on science diplomacy. As you said, today's session focuses on tech diplomacy, and there are many questions that are immediately raised. For example, what is the relationship between science diplomacy and tech diplomacy? When did tech diplomacy come about? Is it more than a hype, than a buzzword? How do different countries actually practice tech diplomacy, also practice tech diplomacy in relationship to science diplomacy? Many, many interesting questions that we will explore today. And in order to do that, we have assembled an absolute stellar panel. And I would like to very briefly introduce them. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they are speaking. We agreed on an initial question beforehand, so we have an order in which they will be speaking, and I will introduce them right now in that order. So I was saying that tech diplomacy, there's this question, is it just a hype, just a buzzword? And I think there's no better person than to counter that argument than Martin Rauchbauer. Martin is a senior diplomat in the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was the Austrian tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. And he was one of the very early tech ambassadors, one of the very early people who were posted to Silicon Valley with the specific aim of practicing tech diplomacy. Martin is also the founder of the Tech Diplomacy Network, and it is mainly in this capacity, I think, that he will be speaking today. So he will be reflecting on both of these experiences. And Martin will deliver a keynote in which he summarizes his experiences and gives us this first glimpse into how tech diplomacy is practiced. And I'm very much looking forward to that. Then let me introduce Professor Markus Korn-Probst. He's Professor of International Relations at the Vienna School of International Relations, also known as the Diplomatische Akademie Wien. He was also a researcher and taught at various universities around the world, Ohio State University, Oxford University, and University College London. He is an academic, and he has done a lot of work on reflecting on diplomacy and the relationship between diplomacy and technology, and very recently also on tech diplomacy with a special issue. Speaking of that, we also have to bring in Professor Cornelio Biola. I don't think there is any scholar who has more depth and breadth in looking at digital diplomacy and in looking at the interplay between diplomacy and new technology, in particular digital technology. He is a professor of digital diplomacy at the University of Oxford. There, he's also the course director of the Global Governance and Diplomacy Master of Science and the head of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. And as I said, I can't imagine a better person to cover these kinds of topics because of decades of experience researching these kinds of topics and speaking on them. So Cornelio, absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's busy time for the academics right now. We also have from Singapore, Mr. Chris Leck, another practitioner who will reflect on his work as a practitioner. He's the Chief International Partnerships Officer at the Agency for Science, Technology and Research, A*STAR, in Singapore. He is also the Group Chief Technology Officer at the Public Sector Science and Technology Policy and Plans Office at the Prime Minister's office in Singapore. He speaks on these topics. He thinks about how countries navigate disruption, and he will also reflect on the perspective of Singapore being perhaps a small country that really is punching above its weight. So I'm very much looking forward to these reflections. Last but not least, we have Kochapan Bomanchayarit. She's a policy analyst at the Office of National Higher Education and the Science Research and Innovation Policy Council in Thailand. She has a wealth of experience working in international projects, in international development, for example, at GIZ, but also Save the Children and Plan International. And she is an alumni of one of the ASAF programs, so it's very nice to have her here and now be a speaker rather than a program participant. Absolute pleasure to have you here, Coach Japan. So after this introduction, without further ado, I actually would like to hand over to Martin for his keynote. As I said, he is one of the important practitioners of tech diplomacy. He's one of the early, so to speak, tech ambassadors who was posted to Silicon Valley. And yeah, Martin, the floor is yours. I'm very much looking forward to your introduction to the topic.
Thank you so much, Katharina. It's a huge pleasure to be here among such distinguished practitioners and theoreticians of tech diplomacy. some of which I have had the pleasure to work and interact with in the past. I think that it's very interesting to reflect for a moment about the context in which we're doing that. This is the Asia-Europe Foundation. And I would like to also point out to my current role that Katharina didn't mention. I'm at the moment in the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the Asia desk, in charge of the relations with ASEAN, Southeast Asian nations, and the European Union and ASEAN, while we are speaking, are trying to figure out how they can work closely together. And of course, the future topics, innovation, technology is among, the topics that those two very dynamic regions, in important regions, geopolitically, economically, and also technologically, are talking. So that's a very concrete example why tech diplomacy is important. Just if we focus on the two regions, Asia and Europe, that kind of give the context of today's encounter. I am very, very pleased to talk a little bit about the history of tech diplomacy and thereby indirectly answer some of the questions that Katharina raised. What is it? How do we define tech diplomacy? Is it something new? Is it a hype? Is it something to stay? And I have a kind of a differentiated, a kind of ambivalence to those questions myself. But I will maybe start with very, very quickly talk about my own personal history as it is, as Katharina mentioned, linked to the history of tech diplomacy in the kind of current form that we speak about it. I personally was posted as an Austrian career diplomat in 2016 to San Francisco, to Silicon Valley, in order to establish a diplomatic outpost, an innovation outpost of Austria for the foreign ministry as a career diplomat. In 2016. And that was about, I would say, the time where a lot of other countries were doing that as well. A year later, the Danes came and opened the tech embassy and appointed their first tech ambassador there. And if we look back 10 years, which is a super long time in diplomacy, but an even longer time in the history of technology development, so it's almost like a century, there was a very, very different attitude when we think of the relationship between government and the private sector. The attitude was, I think, it goes back to the origin of the digital infrastructure of the internet in the 90s, where really the internet was seen as a tool of independence, of emancipation from government influence. And I think that kind of atmosphere remained in Silicon Valley during the times of the tech boom. Government was not cool. It was something to stay away from. Regulation was something frowned upon. In that kind of atmosphere, a lot of young entrepreneurs, startups would come to Silicon Valley. Some of them extraordinarily successful, would form companies that then later would become global platforms and, famous unicorns. And everybody at the time around the world was looking with awe and sometimes envy and admiration to Silicon Valley as a region, as a model. To copy, to somehow harness, the insights and bring them back to their own countries. That was, so to speak, the diplomatic efforts were largely commercial. How can we connect our ecosystems with Silicon Valley? What can we learn from Silicon Valley? And so my task back then was to establish a network, to establish context, to help Austrian companies, to help Austrian startups, to connect with venture capitalists, with whatever today we consider as as an innovation ecosystem, to the universities, but also, of course, to the tech companies itself. And when we talked about big tech, then it was, of course, we were thinking mainly of the big platforms, Facebook, or as it now is called, Meta, Google, but also Microsoft, Amazon. Those were the big companies that had, started out as startups, but became big and dominant. And I think it is exactly that perspective, this big dominance, that very soon after my arrival changed the mood in Silicon Valley. out of tech euphoria became very quickly, I would say, in 2017, already a year later, 2018 was kind of a key year, and I will say why, became the year of the tech lash. Where just symbolically, we are thinking of Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and head of Meta, having to testify in front of the U.S. Congress, an iconic, famous moment where one could also see how important big tech had become for politics, for societies, but also kind of the distance, the kind of questions that were asked that were often showed also that how helpless and uninformed politicians were when they asked their questions. He also later in that year, in 2018, testified in front of the European Parliament, where the politicians were kind of better informed already and asked better questions. And of course, it was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, a huge breach of privacy. The European first big regulation, the GDPR, had entered in force in 2018. And I think immediately governments in that time realized that tech was not just a kind of a commercial, entrepreneurial topic of innovation, but it was a highly political topic. And I think diplomats who were posted in Silicon Valley realized that they had a political role to play as well, that they were kind of representing in some ways the reaction of nation states to the emergence of these big tech companies and their power. And this power was such that it was infringing in some ways. And that was at least the feeling that many citizens and governments were having, infringing on what we would call the traditional field of sovereignty. When it was the information space, it was kind of the time where societies, where citizens, where civil society was pointing out and noticing about the kind of dark side of social media. Yes, it provided us with connectedness around the globe, but it also created dependencies, particularly among our young people. And there were many ills that we were kind of discovering as a society there. And there was a feeling that we needed the state, and we needed to redefine the relationship between the state and the private sector, particularly in the tech sector. And so I would say tech diplomacy emerged at a time of big tech's biggest success. At the same time, it was also a sign of a reaction of the nation state around the world towards these ills or the dark sides of new frontier technologies. At least this is the case from Europe, and I think there we also have to be careful, particularly in a context like today, where tech diplomacy is often associated with a very European approach, a regulatory approach towards tech companies. But in the meantime, I think tech diplomacy as a practice has spread around the globe. There are many countries around the globe that actively practice tech diplomacy, that use that term, that use that concept, that have appointed tech diplomats to Silicon Valley or to other innovation centers. And of course, they come with different kind of outlooks, with different kind of interpretations. Some of it more positive towards technology, sometimes more optimistic about the potential of frontier technologies solving some of their problems. Some of them, with a lot of hopes of solving global problems, and others feeling kind of even more left behind, feeling that the gap was not just a gap between governments and the private sector, but within the entire country. Particularly, this is true, of course, of the global south, the digital gap that many countries have felt has only widened with the advance of new frontier technologies. So, we have to think now carefully that tech diplomacy might mean different things for different countries, for different regions. And it also might mean kind of, and that's the theory of our colleague of the Brazilian tech diplomacy department, Eugenio Garcia, who says tech diplomacy is kind of an umbrella term that means a lot of things. It means, for some, it means it's just a new word for digital diplomacy. For others, it's just a continuation of the traditional science and tech diplomacy, which of course has been going on for many decades. Some have a focus there on science and tech diplomacy being a kind of a child of the Cold War, between the US and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies, where science diplomacy had a very specific role to play in a very specific geopolitical context. And then, of course, I think tech diplomacy also today is a reaction of this new geopolitical context and new, relatively new geopolitical rivalries on this planet between the US and China. Where's Europe? Where's big countries like India or Brazil playing in this context? And what is the role of new technologies in this sector? So some are saying it's kind of an umbrella term for looking at security, of cybersecurity, of resilience, of competition, of geopolitical competition. Others are even looking, and we in Austria had even thought of that cultural diplomacy has a tech element on it, particularly if we think of the new possibilities of new media and new technologies, connecting artists around the world, as well as a cultural exchange. So in some sense, and we have made this claim at the Tech Diplomacy Network, the question is not all diplomacy, or will not one day we can drop tech diplomacy because all diplomacy will be tech diplomacy, and it's just simply paying tribute to a changing, transforming world, and with it a transforming and changing international system that we need to understand and still grasp, and particularly with a view of the US administration and how its approach has really changed international relations, and tech diplomacy in that kind of context just being kind of an instrument, a new instrument, a help in order to navigate this new and changing international system. So I would maybe say just a few remarks. When 10 years ago, nations in Silicon Valley were largely interested in their own commercial enterprises, creating innovation outposts, tech diplomacy also means in Silicon Valley and in other places around the world that countries cooperate, work together, collaborate in different formations. Alone in Silicon Valley, there are several of those that practice tech diplomacy in a collaborative effort. So tech diplomacy also means countries working together in order to interact with tech companies that also increasingly work together when it comes to navigating global issues. And that's the other side of it. Tech diplomats are not just working in governments. We claim that, at least in the Tech Diplomacy Network, that also big tech companies and even small and medium-sized tech companies need to look at tech diplomacy as a tool in their business model in order to navigate this changed and transformed world. And therefore, we will find tech diplomats, so to speak, in the private sector as well. They also need to work together in order to understand and manage and navigate well this new and changing world. And therefore, we see different interesting forms of collaboration. Tech diplomacy can mean also a lot of other things. I won't go into that, but that is a brief overview, historic overview over the last 10 years, how tech diplomacy has evolved. And I think while I am willing to say that it might be in some ways an overblown hype, when people talk about something, a new concept, a shiny new thing, without really thinking of what it actually means, I do think that while diplomacy, many forms of diplomacy might have been practiced a long time before the emergence of tech diplomacy in that very similar and same way, I do think, and there I'm very, very convinced that the international system is really rapidly changing. New technologies play an important role in it, and we need to therefore adapt the way we practice diplomacy to those new realities. Whether we call it tech diplomacy or not is less important than that governments realize that they need to change and that they need to adapt.
Thank you so much, Martin, for the keynote, for this broad introduction. It's a very nuanced picture you painted, but also this we can already call it, as you did, historical overview of tech diplomacy. Very much appreciated. I also picked up on the phrase, maybe soon all diplomacy will be tech diplomacy. We can discuss this. What I would like to do now is what we call a lightning round. And What I mean by that is a very, very short response from each of the other panelists. So the question for them is, what resonated most with you from the keynote? And if you can give maybe a word or a sentence, just very briefly, what did you pick up from what Martin just said? What resonated most with you? And let me go in the order, perhaps Chris, Cornelio, Marcus, and then Kochapan. So in one sentence, one word, what stood out for you? What grabbed you? Chris, please.
Yeah, well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to join this webinar session. It's a pleasure to be here. I was fascinated, I think, by Martin's presentation. But I thought what stood out most was really this, what he said about the concept of tech diplomacy really expanding, going beyond just scientists, going beyond just technologists or diplomats coming, to tackle issues, but also really expanding to include many other stakeholders. Whether if you're talking about startups, small and medium enterprises, but even in government, not just diplomats, but also I think many other agencies now coming into play to really have that conversation, to look at the big challenges of our time, and then to work on this together.
Wonderful. Cornelio, what was it that stuck with you?
Thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction to the topic. And the word or the concept that struck me, because I think it remains underexplored, is the concept of power in the context of tech diplomacy. Martin mentioned that the reason we see nowadays a number of new tech ambassadors moving to Silicon Valley or to other areas of incubation, innovation hubs is because a recognition that these tech companies have power. And this is a concept that remains underexplored because there are two dimensions to it, very briefly. One, it may dilute state power. We're wondering whether Martin thinks that after 8 years of involvement, engagement with tech companies, if he believes states that imbalance between states, national states and tech companies has increased or actually has decreased or actually has increased and accelerated. So that's one imbalance. And the other thing is to what extent traditional state power is maximized by tech companies. I remember a statement from G.D. Vance, the vice president of United States before the election. He didn't repeat that statement after the election, but he said, or he tried to threaten European states or the European Commission, saying, don't touch American tech companies because then Article 5 of NATO might come into the discussion. So you have this kind of ambivalence about how tech companies or tech power operates, and that has tremendous implication for international order. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Cornelio, for already bringing in this very important topic of power and already distinguishing it for us. Marcus, going to you. Anything that stood out this morning from the keynote so far?
Yeah, three points very quickly, Martin. Thanks a lot for a very insightful talk again. So for me, it's adapt. I wrote it down: adapt, agency, and work together. These three stuck with me. So diplomacy obviously is a very, very old institution, and it has to adapt. And in our days, it's not enough anymore to simply sit at a capital, being posted to a capital, but you actually have to go to tech companies too. And with that, you have to adapt a lot of things that have been taken for granted in diplomacy for a very long time. So the way you communicate, for instance, is a bit different, and I think we're going to get at that later. A second one, so there's oftentimes all kinds of assumptions about tech determinacy, so that there's really nothing we can do, so technology changes our lives and that's it. But if one takes tech diplomacy seriously, then there's a lot of agency. And the third one is Martin talked a lot about working together, learning. Yeah, I think that's the key, and how these different actors can work together and learn from one another, because they sometimes are really very, very different. Yeah. So the generalist, the diplomat on the one hand side, and say the software developer on the other. That I think is also going to be an exciting issue to be explored in the next hour or so.
Thank you so much. I thought your reference to agency and working together very, very hopeful. Thank you for that, because then we can change things, we can adjust things, and capitalize perhaps also on some optimism. Kochapan, last but not least, what was it that resonated with you perhaps from the keynote this morning?
Okay, thank you very much for the keynote, Martin. I find out that Martin's reflections are very insightful, especially how he connects diplomatic practice with the realities of the technology ecosystem. And what I appreciate most from his keynotes is the reminder that the tech policy is not only about managing your political ship, but also about the creating the right governance foundations. And it's very important for us as we continue developing evidence-based and inclusive science, technology, and innovation policy as well. And many of these points align with the work that we are doing in many countries, especially on building national capacities, strengthening the scientific interfaces, or and ensuring the states can participate meaningfully in global tech governance and navigating the global issues together. And as he framing help us think more strategically about how countries can position itself in these evolving landscapes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Governance, definitely a topic that we will come back to. Thank you so much for, well, obviously the keynote from Martin, but also the very brief reflections from the others. I think we already touched on all these different elements, all these different points, which is fantastic because now we have the broad picture. And I think as we continue the discussion, as Marcus said, we will be able to dig a little bit deeper into each of the points that have just been mentioned. So I'm really, really, really grateful for together painting this picture. I'm also grateful for the people who are here in the room with us, listening and using the chat to interact. I've already seen your introductions coming into the chat, so thank you very much for that. And it's just amazing to see all these different people with all these different backgrounds and these really excellent initiatives and careers both from Europe and Asia being here and coming together. And I also want to take this opportunity to issue a reminder that we want to make this as interactive as possible. This means if you have any question, any comment, please feel free to use the chat. We are monitoring this. I'm looking at it, and then the wonderful colleagues from ASIF are also looking at it. And I will bring in the questions form, perhaps specific questions into the conversation as they become relevant and as they appear. So please don't hold back. Use the chat to comment and to ask questions. Very much appreciated if you do that. So I said we painted this broad picture, and now we want to dive in a little bit deeper with some specific questions for each of our panelists. And I'm going to start with Marcus, and I'm going to start perhaps with the hardest question. Let's be honest here, and the hardest question for the person with the academic background in diplomacy. And the question sounds simple, but I think it's really the hardest question. The question is, what is tech diplomacy, and how can both scholars and practitioners make sense of it? And if there's no one specific definition, because Martin already mentioned it's an umbrella term, so is there one specific definition? But if there's not, is there perhaps elements that can guide our thinking on tech diplomacy? But as I said, probably the hardest question. What is tech diplomacy? Marcus, what would you answer?
Thanks a lot. I'll try. So, I mean, what is tech diplomacy not? Yeah. So tech diplomacy is not the kind of usual, say, I don't know, European diplomacy of the 19th century. Yeah. So that then one thinks about the Congress of Europe, summit diplomacy, and all of that. Yeah. It is not being posted simply to the capital of another country. But at the same time, it's not entirely new either, right? So Martin alluded to that already. Science and technology have been a field of diplomacy for quite some time and have oftentimes challenged diplomacy, so the traditional ways of doing it. And Cornelio and I, we did a special issue, and trying to define tech diplomacy, we alluded to two key aspects. One of them, tech diplomacy is dynamic. So it's actually it's a little bit like nailing custard to a wall, yeah. So that makes it difficult to define because it has to evolve. And so in one ways, for instance, yes, it all started in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, but tech diplomacy has already moved beyond that. So that is one of the dynamisms that we see. We're probably going to get a little bit into these issues, but when Martin got involved in tech diplomacy, then some of the tech issues at that time were a little different from what they are now. Yeah, so artificial intelligence, for instance, has leapfrogged and all of that. So it's very, very dynamic. The other key feature is that it is plurilateral. So it is not an endeavor where representatives of two states talk to one another, not only, yeah. It is not something where, say, an international organization features as well, but it's really plurilateral. So there are lots of different actors. And amongst these actors are major tech companies. So that really makes it stand out. And which means, by the way, that it's not easy to achieve these things that we have a little touched upon in the first round. Now it is learning from one another, doing things together, because all of these different actor groupings they've been socialized into doing things very differently. Yeah. And so tech diplomacy, amongst other things, can also be understood as a bridge. So building bridges across different actor groupings, across different cultures of doing things together.
Thank you so much. So are we nailing custard to a wall? I think you've painted an excellent picture of that custard on the wall, dynamic, plurilateral, bringing actors together that naturally do things differently. So diplomacy as the mediation of also these different cultures. Thank you so much for this introduction. I think it's very useful to keep that in mind, not so much as a fixed definition, but as you said, as points of orientation. So thank you so much for that. And now I want to move to Cornelio. Marcus, you already mentioned you and Cornelio did a special issue together on tech diplomacy. Again, one of the very early proper academic engagements with the topic. So, Cornelio, perhaps for you, just to dig a little bit deeper into tech diplomacy, the question, is there anything where you would say tech diplomacy is still distinct from other kinds of diplomacy? So I'm thinking, for example, of digital diplomacy, which is an important term here, or science diplomacy. If you can also comment on perhaps what led to the emergence of tech diplomacy specifically, so why we are talking about tech diplomacy, and whether or not, and this goes a bit against what Marcus said, but also agrees with it. It's a tricky one. Whether or not we're seeing like a unique moment in diplomacy, because Marcus said it's not quite the old, but it's also not completely different from diplomacy as we know it. So a lot for you to reflect on. But if you can guide us a little bit deeper, so to speak, into tech diplomacy, I would really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Katarina. Yes, indeed, that was a very question that it was in front of us when we started to prepare this special issue, how to distinguish between science diplomacy, digital diplomacy, and tech diplomacy. And we have to realize that, there is a lot of overlap between the three, simply because what we see in this case, the connecting variable is the fact that there is something about science, about technology, facilitating diplomatic relations, if you want to put it in this kind of very broad terms. But there is history. Science diplomacy, it was the first one, right? Starting after 1945 with nuclear technology, science counselors, it was one of the first new posts created at that time. And it was very much about, scientists advising governments or facilitating cooperation. Think about the Arctic Treaty. Think about, the CERN cooperation in Switzerland. And in this case, we have two basic actors, right? We have the scientists and the governments, cooperating with each other. Now, what we've seen in the past 10 years or 15 years, we see what we call now digital diplomacy, expanding a little bit, but also the platforms. We don't have the scientists necessarily. We have, the public very much involved to using different type of operations, setting the agenda. It's a different type of combination. So at the core, when we started to distill the distinction, we came down to the idea that there is different facets of power. And this is why I connected initially to the concept of power, to the keynote, different forms of power. In the case of science, we had this knowledge power. You have very technical, scientific expertise that inform decision making. That was very important and remains important. On digital diplomacy, what we call it was information power, is how to control information dissemination, perception. So how digital tech diplomacy comes into this picture? On one hand, it overlaps with the others on certain aspects because you have to communicate about what is happening, and that was part of the and remains a mission of Martin and others, tech diplomats. It's also about providing scientific expertise, but I think is more. I think it has to recognize that there is a lot of innovation happening very fast. It's not only about scientists and diplomats. You have tech companies, you have many other actors involved in this. Remain uncertain whether the state is in the driving seat. This might connect with something a bit later. But what I think in the case of tech diplomacy, it's about how to master or how to come to grips with the idea of innovation power. So what is unique here? I think unique is what Marcus called its dynamism. I will call it acceleration. It's very fast, right? We are talking about in 2016 about the negative implication of disinformation, platform that was very much, and then artificial intelligence. I started recently to look at the issue of quantum, which is coming and is coming fast. So the quantum technology, so this is very fast, and that has implications because I'm not sure whether this we are well prepared for the pace of events, because I think the balance of power has changed as well. Now diplomats operate in the landscape where you have tech companies, you have infrastructure providers, you have standard bodies, which I think in many cases have more practical influence than the states. So decisions that shape global interaction or data governance are often taken in innovation hubs, right? Or corporate boardrooms that rather than in Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And with that, I think also you have to pay attention to the fact that the foundation of international order is changing. Is more about technical design issues. So encryption protocols, chip architecture, cloud infrastructure, AI safety frameworks, rather than traditional treaties alone as we used to be in the past, right? So these choices, the way in which you define these protocols, infrastructure, safety networks, have very long-term geopolitical influences. And that redefines, what with Marcus in another volume, we start to think about digital international order. So this is, I hope it try to clarify, a little bit of the distinction overlaps, but also looking forward, I think the dynamism and the fact that the power is changing away from the states to some new type of factors will have important implication for how this digital international order is developing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very, very insightful. And thank you also for taking us deeper into this question of power, which I see as also already a question that is being raised among participants. And perhaps to this question, unique, you mentioned acceleration, you mentioned the foundation of international relations or diplomacy is shifting because these technological issues become very, very prominent. Thank you so much. As I said, thank you so much for that, for painting this picture for us. And I want to add another element to this, which brings me to Chris. And Chris, for you, so to speak, a practitioner question, if you will, because what I'm really interested in is, and you're the ideal person to reflect on that. What is the approach of Singapore in, let me be broad, science, tech, and innovation? diplomacy. And I think for you also what I would be interested in is to reflect on how Singapore manages to influence the global debate on these topics, because it does. And I think there are some elements that might be very interesting to reflect on. So Chris, if you can lead us into these kinds of questions, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Katharina. I mean, maybe let me first say that actually our approach is really a very pragmatic one. And if you're talking about science, tech, and innovation diplomacy, it actually really mirrors our broader foreign policy approach, and which is in large part informed by the unique circumstances that Singapore has found itself in really since our independence. And I'm mindful that actually maybe not all in the audience are maybe so familiar with Singapore, and if you bear with me for a minute, maybe I can paint this broader context, I think, in my response. So as some of you will know, we are a really tiny city-state in Southeast Asia. We're actually smaller than New York City. We have no natural resources to speak of, no hinterland, and we are very much dependent on the global economy for our survival and prosperity. I mean, we've done fairly okay since our independence. We are a financial hub, we're an advanced manufacturing hub, we are a hub in digital innovation and sea transport, so on and so forth. But I think this is all really dependent on us being an open and innovative economy that's fully connected to the world. So we know that being so connected, there are risks, and any perturbations in the international system, any conflicts, any disruptions, that will affect us far more than perhaps a larger country. And so this is really the starting point, in which we approach diplomacy in general for us, but also I think when it comes to science, tech, and innovation diplomacy. So we feel that we do have a role, even as a small state, to help uphold this open, inclusive, and globalized international system that we have today, which in a way has provided a very conducive environment for all of us to do cutting-edge science and innovation, which has brought many benefits to all of us. But in a way, to do that as a small country, I think we know that we must be able to bring value to the table. But how do we do that, right? And I mean, that's the crux of the question that you've asked. As a small country with limited resources, we know that we have to be very clinical and targeted about where we invest the resources we have. So our focus, in many ways, has been in areas that are core to our economy, core to addressing our national priorities. We're investing in many areas that I think many other countries are investing in AI, in quantum, robotics, decarbonization, life sciences. But I think we do it with a specific focus on our needs and how perhaps it can uplift our citizens' lives, our economies, and so on. But I think in so doing, this has really also allowed us to contribute to impactful science and innovation at the global level, as well as to discussions on how we can really harness and govern these technological developments that we are talking about. And the key thing, I think, is for us, we start looking at this issue from a national level. I don't think we start looking at it, from the perspective that from day one, we want to jump in and contribute to international discussions. We know that we have to get our house in order first. And this is really where my Prime Minister's office hat, I think, comes into play. We have an approach or framework that we call policy ops tech integration, which is really about bringing together policymakers, regulators, operations people, technologists and scientists, but also industry, from startups, SMEs, the large corporates, and also the public, to think about how we should together perhaps develop, deploy, and scale technology solutions effectively in an efficient way, but also taking into account what are some of the governance challenges and how do we need to mitigate any negative externalities. So this is really our starting point, and when we, along the way, have any learnings from these experiences, this is where we then try to lean forward to contribute to global discussions. And maybe I'll just give one quick example because I know time is tight. I think in the area of AI, some of my colleagues from the Infocom Media Development Authority, they have developed and released some guidelines and frameworks to do AI governance, which have in a way later then contributed to international and regional guidelines. For example, the ASEAN Guide on AI Governance and Ethics. And Singapore also chairs the Forum of Small States, and in this Forum of Small States, or the FOSS, We have also worked together with some other countries to develop this AI playbook from small states. So these are just some examples of how I think we have tried to, in a very pragmatic way, I think, contribute. But really, our starting point is looking first nationally at the challenges that we have to deal with, and then how do we overcome it. And if there are lessons learned, then we will try and contribute these to the international discussions.
Thank you so much. I took a lot of notes again. Policy tech integration, I thought really interesting approach that might be useful for a lot of other actors to just think in these terms of bringing people together, which again brings us to this question of diplomacy. So thank you so much for these reflections. And then in our discussion to get even more specific, I want to pick up on this question of governance that Kochapan already brought into the discussion, which I think is crucial. How does tech diplomacy contribute to governance? And here I turn exactly to you, Kochapan, with this question of how does tech diplomacy in particular impact AI governance? And I know this is a topic close to your heart, so to speak. So if you can share some reflections on that to also add this kind of perspective on governance in one particular topic. Cornelia already mentioned quantum, but let's also look at artificial intelligence, AI, a little bit. Kochapan, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think that is a critically important question for this era, and to the heart of what the fields of technology diplomacy is designed to achieve. That is about translating rapid technological change, especially AI, into manageable global governance structures. And from many sources, the tech diplomacy positions artificial intelligence not merely as operational tools, but as more like the central subjects of international negotiation and regulatory discussion. And I see that the impacts of the technology diplomacies on AI governance operating across the three core strategic functions, which is about establishing the global norms and regulatory alignment. For example, tech diplomacy is basically the main channel the world use right now to shape and spread the international AI standards, values, and regulatory ideas. And when we talk about AI, everyone's come in their own, and it's different in terms of definitions and assumptions, similar to as Martin has already mentioned. So the tech diplomacy help us in building a shared language. For example, in the case of the EU and US trade and technology councils, literally negotiates of what AI and risk even mean. And that process is crucial because it's bridged the gap between diplomats who speak in policy terms and the technical experts who speak in engineering terms. And there's also the what you call it, the umbrella effect. Right? The technology diplomacy try to pull all the scattered global initiatives under this common direction. The frameworks, there are frameworks such as a global digital compact that aim to be on that umbrella, something that is hold all the fragmented efforts together and set out the basic rules and value everyone can agree on. And besides, and how different regions might project on their regulatory influence. The EU especially is a good example through the tech diplomacy that it can push that, for example, they push the EU AI Act outwards and shaping the global norms in a way that the smaller countries have to consider. And this is very different approach from the US, and which is prefer the lighter regulations, or China, which is relies more on a state-driven model. And the tech policy is something that the models can negotiate the space. And another thing that I pick up is the technology diplomacy is becoming absolutely essential for navigating the geopolitics tension, right? And it's come with the AI unrest. For example, it's directly shapes how countries hold on to or lost their own sovereignties on the tech space. And AI basically is turned into the geopolitical AI basically turned into that geopolitical flashpoint, and that tech diplomacy helps manage this by pushing for regulatory alignment, because the real underlying issue is the competitions of AI supremacy, especially between two big countries like US and China, which is without coordination, we end up with the fragmentation driven by techno-nationalism. And yeah, and another important part is the contesting the growing powers of the tech companies, and these firms innovate faster than governments, basically speaking. And they control digital infrastructures, and in many ways, they functions like they have their own form of virtual sovereignty. The tech diplomacy is the kind of tool. This is one of the these tools that are available for rebalance this and make sure that the states still have ethical and legal authorities over the algorithmic system. And in terms of like AI governance, cannot just rely on the traditional state-to-state diplomacy governance anymore, and it needs a multilateral approach, and the tech diplomacy is built exactly for that. And it is included since it includes non-state actors such as the big tech companies, as Martin said, like Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, or Google, you name it. And again, real governance has to involve the whole ecosystem, not just governance, but national tech envoys, big tech company, regulators, scientists, engineers, civil society, the tech firm. Now they have the influence that's to many nation states. So like they are not diplomatic actors, but actually they are working like that. And the tech diplomacy brings all these players into the same space. So another important point that I want to mention is about the public-private partnership that also sit at the core of this, because it's helped bridge the knowledge and capability gaps between the public and private sectors. So they make it possible to immobilize resources for responsible AI. And and this collaboration builds a credibility around AI use and help create a shared understanding of what responsible AI should look like across the different stakeholder groups. So in conclusions, I want to finalize it, land it here as finally, the tech diplomacy helps define the roles and responsibility and legitimacies of different actors in AI governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What I really appreciate is that you mentioned multilateralism, United Nations, the Global Digital Compact. I think very important to keep this part of the conversation also in mind. I very briefly want to turn to Martin to basically with the same question that I asked before in reaction to your keynote. What resonated with you so far in our discussion? What stood out to you? What do you see parallels? What are things that made you like listen and notice? Anything in particular you would like to highlight for us? You're still muted.
Well, thank you, Katharina. That there's always and it's funny when diplomats are challenged by technology and don't manage to put on their microphones, as in my case. I really was very impressed by the different statements. They're very, very rich comments and reflections on very many different levels, which reflects a little bit the complexity and the breadth of tech diplomacy itself. I wanted to maybe start with Chris and Kocha Pan and their approach, which there were many gold nuggets there. When Chris talked about Singapore and, with a lot of modesty said, we need to start, that our starting point is that we need to keep our house in order and then, take the global system for granted and see how we can then position ourselves. I think that is actually not only true for Singapore, but for a lot of nation states that are in the same situation. There is a changing system. There is a growing feeling of not being in the driving seat, whether this is towards the private sector, or whether this is towards the changing international system. And it is kind of looking at agency. What Mark has said at the beginning. Where is agency? Where is the hope there? And I think by looking looking at your own ecosystem and your own capacity of innovation, I think that is a very, very good starting point. And there are many success stories around the globe. It's not just Silicon Valley, and whether or not that is a success story. And the same thing is, of course, true at what Kochapan said. And when we talk about frontier technologies like AI or quantum, you often hear, that there's really not much nation states can do, because the big tech companies, they determine everything, and I don't think that is entirely true. I do think that states do have an important role, whether this comes to investment in groundbreaking science, and in I think even if you look at the story of Silicon Valley, it's often underestimated how big of a role a support and in groundbreaking research the state, the U.S. government in that sense, and even the military in that history played and continues to play, despite of what we are hearing. And at the same time, I do think when we talk about diplomacy, I do think, as Kochapan mentioned, there are many things that actually need to be regulated on the one hand, but also discussed and talked about, whether this is about shared language, whether this is about sitting together and looking at the kind of risks and threats that these technologies present, not just towards citizens or towards AI supremacy, competition. This is one way to look at it, but many of these threats are associated with common threats to humanity and risks to humanity, and that there is a common interest of nation states that have very different approaches, very different systems, to sit together and talk about that. I think that was the case, obviously, in previous technology discussions. If we think of nuclear armament, nuclear power, and the role that diplomacy and international negotiations played and still continues to play, in just in some ways talking about it, providing an international framework of that, to talk about risks, to talk even about competition, to talk about proliferation. Of course, AI and quantum are very different technologies, but there is something to talk about, and I think those discussions about how to find the right framework for those are extraordinarily important. Maybe last but not least, this question about power that Cornelio posed, I think that this is very interesting, but it depends a lot on the answer to this question of the relationship between state power and the power of these big platforms, of these big tech players. Depends a lot of where you look at. Of course, the answer is very different when you look at a country like the US, where we kind of had seen at the beginning of the US administration a super close, almost like a merging between the power of Silicon Valley and the US government at that point. Individual tech entrepreneurs having a huge and large influence on actually US foreign policy decisions. That can be very questionable, but it is a reality. And if you look at another place, at China, there you will have a very different relationship. There we will see the state in recent years reestablished its control over those big Chinese tech companies. I would say that is a very different power dynamic there. I do want to maybe also say that, on these very different complex levels of tech diplomacies, one of the real challenges is, of course, from a government perspective, from the perspective of a state tech diplomat, from a bureaucrat. Not only is it challenging, to keep up with the new technologies, I think that is actually the lesser of the problems, because I don't think that a tech diplomat necessarily needs to understand exactly how these technologies work, you know, to the level of an engineer. I think he needs much more to understand what they mean. But what I do think is the real problem is the structural problems of how states operate. Every tech diplomat realizes it's often harder to coordinate, you know, within your own government a position than it is to talk to a tech company. So there are a lot of challenges, structural challenges ahead in order for turning tech diplomacy into an effective and useful tool for governments.
Thank you so much for reflecting on these many different aspects and rounding up this initial round of questions. Very much appreciated. Speaking of questions, again, a reminder for our audience to ask their questions, and if you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, that would be perfect. Makes our life on this end a little bit easier. There's indeed there are many questions from the audience that I want to get into. I'm actually going to start with the question of power. This has been raised in a number of different comments, specifically in terms of the digital divide. Specifically in terms of knowledge, technology, capabilities accumulating in the hands of a few, as we also see with big tech companies, but also in the hands of a few countries. And so the question here is, what can be done, or perhaps specifically, what can tech diplomacy do to counter that, to counter a widening of the digital divide, raising inequalities between countries? Any reflections on that? Perhaps I'm going to look specifically again at you, Martin, perhaps as a practitioner, but also Cornelio, Marcus, perhaps you have some reflections on that. But perhaps let's start very briefly with Martin and then move to Cornelio, and then anyone else can come in.
Yeah, very, very, very quickly. I think when it comes to the digital gap, and when it comes to countries that kind of start out with, you know, how to form a coherent and effective tech diplomacy, I do think that there are two things that are important. I think you can do actually a lot with this traditional diplomatic approach of just being present, you know, wherever you think you need to be present. That does make a lot of difference. If you send an able, digitally or technologically savvy diplomat into you know, either an innovation ecosystem that is important for you, or even, you know, to places like of political power as well, where there's a lot of regulatory efforts taking place. I think just with connections, personal connections, establishing a network, tapping into a network of your diaspora, that you know, a lot of countries have very successful tech entrepreneurs in startups or in tech companies that you can tap into. This provides tremendous benefits. And the second thing is working together with other countries, working together with civil society, working together with tech companies. That does provide a lot of benefits. It is, I think, a lot of bureaucracies and foreign services are often more innovative than other bureaucracies, are really very challenged in changing their ways. They need to open up and engage with these different and new actors. And I think it's very obvious for those countries that engage in that there are tremendous benefits there.
Thank you so much, Martin. Cornelia, do you want to add?
Yes, indeed. I think on the question of power here. So what is power in this tech age? So you have to realize that power, the sources of power have changed. We talk about control over data, right? Without data, you are dead in the water. You know, we cannot do AI. You talk about cloud infrastructure. Who has control over the cloud infrastructure? Who has control of the critical supply chains? This is now power. And of course, we have different models. Martin already mentioned, right? We have this kind of emerging fusion of tech power and state power in the United States. China already had that one. Europe is in the regulatory mood, but at the moment lacks the tech capacity to do many things. So I think looking forward, it will be interesting how this distribution of power, in a sense, changes a little bit, the dynamic. I think in the next 5 years, probably we're going to be trapped in this kind of tech competition, mainly between the United States and China. And then that will going to raise some interesting question about small states, like, for instance, Singapore. How are they going to place in this kind of picture? They're already struggling, I think, from what I heard, with this kind of dilemma here, right? Is not only the territory, it's not only the traditional sources of power that we had in the past. You have to control certain critical choke points, and that has to do with data, has to do with infrastructure, has to do with algorithms, has to do with high supply chains. But that will be interesting in this context when we talk about regional blocks, like in the past, whether it's EU or NATO, and so on, are all based on territory. That you have a threat, and then they come. Are we going to look in the next 5-10 years to some regional blocks that are formed around technological ecosystems? And I can easily see a combination of Japan, Australia, Korea, Singapore, or Europe and others coming together around issues revolving trust technological ecosystem rather than territory, as it used to be in the past, right? So these are tech geopolitics. It's a new field that we see nowadays emerging, in which the source of power has changed. And that implies also a challenge for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? There are rising new issues. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm very happy from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Austria absorbing Martin into the fold, because these are issues that have to be handled, right? Not in the traditional sense, but also, we talk about AI governance, we talk semiconductors, quantum technologies, data governance. All Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if they want to be credible, they need to learn these tools of the trade. So in a sense, I agree with Martin. At some point, tech diplomacy and diplomacy will become, fusion, because, if you don't understand this, you'll be left behind. Digital divide, but with very costly implications for you. So that's my sort of semi-positive, semi-negative mood about the future of tech diplomacy from the perspective of distribution of power.
Thank you so much. Anyone else who wants to comment on this particular question? Marcus, you looked? No? Okay. Okay, good. Then I have a very specific.
No, I'd like to say something just very briefly. No, I think that I think we're probably at a critical juncture there right now. Yeah. So we have on the one hand the rise of tech, and we have on the other hand a geopolitical, geoeconomic turn. And that's troublesome. I mean, when the two come together, geopolitics, geoeconomics is basically about zero sum. And obviously, and Martin has sketched that very well already. So if we look at the US, if we look at China, then there obviously are linkages between government and tech companies. The nature of these linkages is quite different, but there are linkages. And there, I think there's ideal. Typically, there are really two pathways. Yeah, so the one is down power politics and all kind of different facets of power. The kind of traditional facets, the kind of new tech facets that Cornelia talked about, and they come together. And that really is then is a competition amongst great powers, where even states that punch above their weights in terms of when one looks at size and tech and everything, Singapore is definitely one of them. Yeah, then even they will find it difficult to play their role in this kind of great power game. What is, on the other hand, there's this scenario very much which is very much the assumption of the Global Digital Compact, that there really is reference being made to humankind. and that there is this belief and that we can change things for the better for humankind. That is an opportunity that tech offers to us is quite clear in every way. Yeah, economics, environment, everything, health. Yeah. But whether we're going to get there is the big question, of course. And one more thing about the power, that there's always an elephant in the room with tech diplomacy and power and everything, because the way how tech diplomacy sees itself is it's basically focused on the economic side, not on the traditional security side. Yeah? That's something that the Global Digital Compact does as well. But obviously, we are living through times where weapon systems are modernized, command structures are being redone in very, very fundamental ways, based on advances in digital technology and beyond. Yeah. So this the power issue really is a very large one.
It
Can
is.
I
It
maybe?
isn't. Oh, sorry. Go
Oh,
ahead, Chris.
sorry.
Of
No, I
course.
just wanted to add a quick comment as well, but maybe Catherine, you wanted to comment on Marcus's comments
Actually, I
first, or?
wanted to turn to you, so this is
Ah,
ideal. There is
okay.
perhaps you can reflect on the power question and then
Mhm.
add something, which is a very specific question that came in the chat, which is targeted at you, so to speak. And it's about tech literacy. And the question says that there's a huge effort in Singapore to raise tech literacy. AI courses for seniors are, for example, managed. Skill Future Singapore. And perhaps if you can also comment on that, because we had this very specific question, and how Singapore therefore manages to maybe be a bit more tech forward or tech positive in the population. But yeah, if you can also
Sure.
comment on that, I would
Yeah.
appreciate it. But definitely over to you, Chris.
Right. So maybe on the issue of power first, I just wanted to make a quick comment. Maybe I'm a bit more of a bit of an optimist in a way, but from the practitioner's perspective, I thought as governments or even civil society or otherwise, there is room for us to really plug in and reach out to the tech companies to try and work with them where we can. But this is also where, in a way, it's not just about having a conversation, but really exploring what are potential projects that between governments and some of these tech companies we can work together on. Because you need to understand, their tech, where they are at, what's their agenda, how they intend to roll out the technologies over a period of perhaps several years. And the only way to do that is, if as governments we get our hands dirty working with them in projects. And it's easier said than done, but I think it's something that at least we have tried to do. And I talked about bringing value to the table earlier, from the perspective of state-to-state relations, having that at the international table. But I think that same principle would apply. I mean, even talking to some of these big tech companies as governments, what are perhaps what's the value that you can bring to the table with them as well? And actually, I think once you have that conversation going, you do find that there are things that they do appreciate working with you on. They do need test bits for technologies. They do need feedback on, what the public reactions to some of these things would be, what's politically palatable or not. So there will be means and ways, through which I think governments can have that conversation with the tech companies, and hopefully through that you reduce that power differential a little bit, and you can perhaps find some way of getting along, maybe. But on the other question about tech literacy, yes, it's an area that I think we are putting quite a lot of emphasis on across Singapore society in general. I mean, we're starting first within the public service, trying to make sure that even within the public service, our officers are brought to a minimum baseline in terms of where they are at AI literacy-wise. We hope that, of course, the next step is not just to be aware of what AI can do, but to actually be able to actively harness the capability of AI. And we want that to be something that all of our officers are able to do, at least in a simple way. Being comfortable with using AI in their everyday work for all of the officers we have, and then for perhaps a smaller group, where they need to deal with more sophisticated AI, embodied AI, spatial computing, and so on, then that's another layer of skills that this subgroup perhaps would need to build. So we're starting first within the public service, even as I think across society we are trying to roll out AI literacy programs across actually not just targeting the old, but I think obviously the youth as well, people in the workforce, and so on and so forth. Because we do believe that this is something that's coming, it's unstoppable, and you just have to have the necessary skills to be able to deal with what's coming.
Definitely agreed. And I think a lot of countries ask themselves exactly that kind of question. I'm also wondering if the literacy efforts also lead to this positive and optimistic picture that you mentioned, that you are also painted. So thank you so much for that. I have the unfortunate position to also have to keep an eye on the clock, and we only have 9 minutes left. So what I would propose is to have one final round going around the table where each of you can offer us a conclusion, a takeaway, but also if you want and if you can, take two more questions into account for this final round. One question I picked up on that I find quite relevant is the question about areas of cooperation in science and technology between Asia and Europe. That will become important or that are important, especially looking to the future, or perhaps areas of science technology cooperation between Asia and Europe that should be explored more. That was one question. And then I would like to take another practical question, which is about how should countries go about setting up a science and technology hub? Should this be top down by the government? Should it be bottom up? Any reflections on that? So if in your final comment can also integrate these two questions, that would be great. If you want to offer us some general final takeaway, we would also really appreciate that. So as I said, a final round, very, very brief, perhaps 1 minute from each of you. I'm very sorry. There's not more time because clearly the discussion is so rich. But let's go for this final round. And I would start with Martin, and then perhaps go on with Kochapan. But Martin, over to you. Martin, you need to unmute.
All right, sorry about that. So I would like to start with a personal reflection on the career profile of tech diplomats, and just say, how extraordinarily excited this is, particularly for people of a younger generation that have, grown up as digital natives, that have grown up with a lot of savviness towards how these technologies work, and to put into practice their own personal experiences, their own personal knowledge, their feel, for this new world that is often different from older generations into the practice of diplomacy. And then I would also say, yes, it is about technological savviness, but it's also about there's a cultural aspect to it as well, to understand, the world. We talked about co-literacy. We talked in some ways of bridging, I think part of being a tech diplomat is to understand not, just the technologies, but also the world where innovation happens, as well as your own world of governments. How does one actually shape one's own background, governance? How does one bring innovation into government? How does one bring a new way of thinking into that? That's all up to us tech diplomats to tackle and to change. And there's a lot of potential as so many things are moving. To the two questions, Asia and Europe, I'm working on that currently. And therefore, I do have a few thoughts on that. I think when it comes, for example, to the region of Southeast Asia and the European Union, I think there are two things that stick out. There are many things, of course, where cooperation is possible. When it comes to new technologies, I think the question of security and resilience comes up a lot. Cybersecurity being one of them. This is something that is very interesting for our Southeast Asian partners, and where there are a lot of commonalities of technologies where we need to where trust Trusted technologies play a large part, as well as climate issues, clean technologies. I think that that is also something, a growing realization in those two regions, that those are top priorities for both regions, political leaders, as well as for citizens. And lastly, the question of bottom up or bottom down when you establish a new post, I think you have to have both. Unfortunately, if you don't have political support for establishing that from the top, it's going to be really, really tough. At the same time, you need to have the flexibility to let such a new posting grow, organically grow, and learn from learning by doing. And if you apply those two principles, you will be successful.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Kochapan.
Okay, thank you very much. From the last round of reflections, I like to reflect on the that the many smaller states have not powerless at all. I mean, building on from what we discussed on what Martin said and Professor Cornelius mentions about our data infrastructures or our evaluation frameworks or our scientific advisory mechanism, so that we don't just react on the global governance structures, but contribute to them. And reflection on the question, I think I like to reflect specifically on the areas of astronomy. Yeah, this might be something that is kind of come up as an emerging, but I mean, emerging topic here, but I think it represents one of the most underdeveloped yet highly strategic area for Asia-Europe cooperation in the coming decades, because I've seen astronomy may seem distant from the immediate policy concerns, but in practice it's drive advance in many other technologies and innovations such as sensors, high-performance computing, space, situational awareness, and big data analytics, and all of which are foundational for both regions. And Asia has enormous geographic advantage for astronomical observation and longitude that is complements European facilities and dark sky size or rapidly expanding space program. And Europe, meanwhile, has a deep expertise in this instrumental precision optics and large research infrastructures that bringing these strengths together would allow both regions to co-develop for the next decade. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising this topic. Being here at the German Aerospace Center, it's obviously close to my heart. And perhaps you're giving us the topic for the next debate, space diplomacy between Asia and Europe. Thank you so much, Kochapan. Then, Marcus, would you like to offer your final reflections?
Yes, happy to do so. So just want to formulate three hopes, actually. So before, and I may have been a little pessimistic, but three big hopes. So the first one, much more tech diplomacy. And by that, I mean that so those doing tech diplomacy are actually properly trained. So diplomacy moves a little bit beyond this old ideal of the well-rounded generalist, but also knows some specific has some specific expertise for tech diplomacy. Also mean that in a sense, the tech diplomacy can actually provide what it needs to get to governance mechanisms internationally. A second one is away from zero sum. So there's decoupling of tech diplomacy on the one hand and tech and innovation and everything on the one hand, and geopolitics and geoeconomics on the other. So I think there really is a case to be made that what is happening here in front of our eyes, something to do with humankind. Yeah. So it's not just about a narrow national interest, something like that. I think there's really something about humankind. And the third one is anticipation. So anticipate what may be the next big breakthroughs. So we talked about some of these things. Cornelio talked about quantum. There's probably all kinds of other things happening, going to happen with AI in the foreseeable future. 5G expansion, and so on and so forth. I think these three, that would be my big hopes.
Thank you for finishing on a hopeful note. Very much appreciated. Cornelio, over to you.
Yeah, let me try to copy Marcus' hopeful note to see whether I can overtake this. So, who I think is going to do well in this kind of new world emerging, and I think the key word here is agility. I mean, we talk about this emerging technology, and I think that the first mover advantage always plays well. You can shape the rules, you can shape the market, you can shape the standards. So agility is a key word. Who is able to do this? So on the negative, on a more pessimistic side, is that do we have the institutional design at the level of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, state able to, absorb this kind of change? And I'm not sure we have it. Ministry of Foreign Affairs were set up for a particular period historically. International organizations the same. So that connects to the second question you ask about how to set up this kind of science hub. I think this is not a place only for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We need a new structure that connects the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, connect with business, with tech companies, connect with some organizations. I very much like this idea of AI literacy that Singapore has put forward. So this is agility. This is not a time for rigidity. This is not a time for this kind of procedure that it takes years to design and implement. So the role here in terms of institutional design has to be considered. I'm looking more forward. People start to look at the United States and China because they are two big players. I think the institution and states that are very agile, and this is why I'm looking very carefully at Singapore, are states that have more to say in this kind of context than the traditional players that we got used to. Agility is the key player, and we can unfold this in different layers: institutional, procedural, normative. But agility has to become the key variable.
Thank you. Very, very much agreed. Last but not least, Chris, your final reflections for us.
Yeah, I said earlier I'm an optimist, and I must say that I'm very much encouraged, I think, by the conversations that are taking place on the tech diplomacy front. And this is in part also because, as a technologist in a way, I also see many challenges coming our way. I think we already talked about some of them, from quantum computing to AI and so on. But there will be more, right? I mean, I think Coach Japan talked about space earlier, and there will be. I'm so sorry. There's a PA test going on in my building at the same time. Um, I Yeah, but so there will be a lot more challenges coming our way, and I think we're going the right direction, uh, including I think having many more forums dealing with the issue of tech diplomacy or science diplomacy. So I'm quite encouraged by that. On the second question, on the areas of cooperation between Asia and Europe, I would encourage I think everyone to take a look at the latest ASEAN Plan of Action on Science, Technology and Innovation that was just released in June this year. So we talked about quite a number of new areas of focus for us in areas like the blue and circular economy, new energy, the blue economy, the circular economy, and so on and so forth, right? So these are all areas that I believe will also have overlaps with what Europe is also working on. So I think there's quite a lot of room to cooperate, and I would encourage everyone to look at that particular document to see where we can work out areas to work on. And on setting up science and tech hubs, I mean, I fully agree that it's something that we need to do both top down and bottom up. But I think where I would also suggest folks think about is really be focused, right? Because maybe again it's coming from a small country, but in general, I think you can't do everything. So you have to play to your strengths and focus on areas where you think you have the right to win, and play at that and focus on that. Yeah. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and again, very much appreciated that that we're finishing on a positive note in a discussion on tech diplomacy, and especially when we look also a bit towards the future areas of cooperation. I'm also picking up things like playing to our strengths, agility, and also that we're dealing broadly with when we talk about tech diplomacy and all the issues that fall under that we are talking about topics that go to the core of humanity and the future of humankind. So I very much appreciated that. So at this point, let me say thank you so much to Martin for the keynote, to our panelists for taking the time to be here in what is a busy schedule at this time of the year. Very much appreciated. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope we get to continue it in other forums. So from my side, thank you very much. Also, thank you for the questions and comments that came through from our audience. Very happy we had this conversation. I'm very happy we can maybe take some next steps together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katharina, for wrapping up today's session so nicely. And again, on behalf of the Asia Europe Foundation, we'd also like to thank all of our speakers here today, and of course to Katharina and DLR for helping to organize and facilitate today's session. And very interesting also here as an organizer to listen in to the different perspectives, and as Katharina mentioned, to finish up on a positive note, and perhaps for our audience here today to think about how you can contribute on these positive notes yourself within your roles and within your countries. So up on the screen currently, you see a bit of a forward looking. So of course, this session is in the context of the greater webinar series that we're organizing. I mentioned earlier in the beginning that we have already organized 2 webinars on science impacting diplomacy and diplomacy impacting science. The recordings are already available on those. And shortly, of course, after this session, the recording will also be available for you to look back and perhaps take some notes on specific things that you were particularly interested in. But then looking ahead, you can also scan the QR code currently on the screen if you're interested in joining us next week or the following week for our upcoming 2 more webinars on the first one more focusing on cultural aspects, so intercultural awareness in science diplomacy, and then in our last week then also on how scientists and diplomats work in practice, so looking into that as a more professional note, let's say. So we hope that you will join us then next week. For those of you joining us in for this webinar series, for our participants joining us for the full training, we'll look forward to seeing you on Thursday when we'll continue to explore the topics brought up here today. Just to look ahead, these are some of the speakers that you can anticipate for next week on the topic. Without further ado, again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. Next week for our next webinar. Thank you all so much for your time today, and good afternoon and good rest of your day joining us from Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.